Wealth is rarely what it appears to be on the surface. Most believe the value of their money is derived from the economic output of their nation or the decrees of their central bank. But true capital operates on a hidden architecture, a framework of leverage and coercion, designed by architects who understand that currency is not a store of value, but a mechanism of control. To master wealth, you must first master the mechanics of this control. History often focuses on political turmoil, but to decode this architecture, you must look to a specific fracture in modern financial history. In the summer of 1971, the global economic order stood on the precipice of total ruin. The Nixon shock severed the United States dollar from its historical peg to physical bullion. This was not merely a temporary policy shift, but the sudden, violent death of the Bretton Woods Agreement. The gold standard failure left the world reserve currency entirely unmoored. Without a tangible asset backing the dollar, international confidence began to evaporate rapidly. Foreign nations, holding vast reserves of American paper, suddenly realized they were holding unsecured debt. The threat of hyperinflation and a catastrophic devaluation loomed over the American empire, threatening to unravel decades of post-war economic dominance and geopolitical supremacy. This unmooring triggered a silent panic within the highest echelons of global finance. A fiat currency cannot survive purely on trust if that trust is actively bleeding out into global markets. The architects of American capital needed a new anchor, something universally desired, universally consumed, and absolutely non-negotiable for the survival of any industrialized modern nation on the planet. The solution was a masterstroke of geopolitical alchemy, a deliberate systemic fix engineered in the shadows of international diplomacy. By 1974, the United States government recognized that while they no longer held the world's supreme monetary asset, they possessed unrivaled military and diplomatic leverage. They identified the one commodity that could replace gold as the lifeblood of the global economy. That commodity was crude oil. Through a series of highly classified negotiations, the United States struck a pivotal agreement with Saudi Arabia. The terms were brutally elegant and historically unprecedented. The United States would provide military protection, advanced weapons, and guaranteed security for the Saudi royal family. In exchange, the kingdom agreed to price all of its oil exports exclusively in United States dollars. This is where the illusion of sovereign choice vanished for the rest of the world. By securing the dominant producer in the Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries, the United States effectively forced the entire global energy market to operate in a single fiat currency. If a nation wanted to keep its lights on and its factories running, it had to acquire dollars at any cost. The petrodollar system was born, transforming the global demand for energy into a mandatory, synthetic demand for American fiat. Japan, Germany, France, and every other industrialized nation suddenly found themselves trapped in a brand new paradigm. To buy oil, they first had to buy dollars, exporting their own hard goods and services to the United States just to acquire the currency needed to survive. But the brilliance of this design extended far beyond mere currency demand. The agreement dictated what Saudi Arabia and other oil-producing nations would do with their massive new influx of American capital. They were heavily incentivized to recycle those surplus dollars straight back into the United States financial system, primarily by purchasing treasury bonds and financing American sovereign debt on an industrial scale. This recycling mechanism created an infinite loop of capital accumulation. The United States could print dollar out of thin air to buy real goods and services from the world. The world used those dollars to buy oil. The oil producers then took those exact same dollars and loaned them back to the United States government, funding domestic deficits and massive military expansion. Contrast this with the rigid constraints of the era before 1971. Under a bullion-backed regime, running massive trade deficits would drain a nation's physical reserves, forcing strict fiscal discipline. The petrodollar shattered that constraint entirely. It allowed the American economy to consume vastly more than it produced, effectively taxing the rest of the globe through the hidden mechanics of currency demand and debt monetization. For developing nations, this architecture became an invisible, suffocating force. Emerging economies were forced to take on massive dollar-denominated debt to finance their infrastructure and basic energy needs. When the Federal Reserve raised interest rates, the cost of servicing that debt skyrocketed, triggering sovereign defaults and economic crises across the global South, all while insulating the American core from the devastating financial fallout. The domestic consumer remained entirely oblivious to this global extraction. To the average citizen, the prosperity of the late 20th century felt like the natural reward of a superior economic model. They did not see that their cheap imports and endless credit were subsidized by a global financial architecture that forced the rest of the planet to absorb American inflation and fund American excess. Exporting inflation became the ultimate privilege of the reserve currency. Whenever the money supply expanded, the resulting devaluation was diluted across the entire global pool of dollar holders. The petrodollar acted as a massive shock absorber, allowing the central bank to execute aggressive monetary policies that would have instantly hyperinflated any other fiat currency in existence, protecting the domestic market from immediate collapse. This dynamic reveals the true nature of modern empire. It is not maintained solely through territorial conquest, but through the absolute monopolization of exchange mediums. The military protects the currency, and the currency funds the military. It is a self-sustaining fortress, where the walls are built of sovereign debt, and the moat is filled with the mandatory global demand for raw energy. Because of this fortress, the dollar was seamlessly weaponized. Access to the international banking system, specifically the clearinghouses that process dollar transactions, became a blunt geopolitical tool. Sanctions could instantly paralyze a rogue state, cutting them off from the global energy trade without firing a single shot. The currency itself became the most lethal instrument in the modern diplomatic arsenal. The petrodollar dictates the underlying logic of global capital flows to this very day. Every major financial institution, sovereign wealth fund, and multinational corporation must structure their portfolios around the immense gravity of dollar liquidity. The mechanics of this system ensure that all roads of international trade ultimately pay a toll to the architects of the fiat reserve, centralizing wealth on a historic scale. Yet empires built on synthetic demand often fall victim to their own hubris. The assumption that the world will forever accept a unipolar financial order breeds a dangerous and blinding complacency. When you control the board for decades, you begin to ignore the players who are quietly rewriting the rules of the game in the shadows of your own aging architecture. We are currently witnessing the first real fractures in this 50-year-old system. Rival nations, exhausted by the relentless weaponization of the reserve currency, are actively constructing parallel financial infrastructures. The geopolitical alignment that birthed the 1974 agreement is shifting, as emerging market coalitions begin to settle bilateral trade in their own local currencies, aggressively bypassing the dollar entirely. The monopoly is definitively breaking. We are seeing major energy contracts negotiated and settled in alternative fiat and even decentralized digital assets. When oil is no longer priced exclusively in dollars, the artificial demand that has sustained American debt for half a century begins to evaporate. The global shock absorber loses its capacity to dilute domestic inflation, forcing the consequences back home. If the mandatory global demand for the dollar collapses, the infinite loop of capital recycling collapses with it. Trillions of dollars held in foreign reserves will come flooding back to their origin, chasing a finite pool of domestic assets. The systemic fix that saved the fiat experiment in the 70s is slowly becoming the primary catalyst for its next profound crisis. Understanding this hidden framework is the difference between being a victim of macroeconomic tides and an architect of your own prosperity. Wealth is not simply about accumulating currency. It is about understanding the systemic forces that give that currency value, recognizing when the foundation is shifting, and positioning your capital outside the blast radius of a collapsing financial paradigm.